Welcome to Ledgers and Law, Lessons from the Trenches, where we bring experienced business and legal leaders together to discuss current topics at the intersection of tax, law, and business. And now, please welcome your hosts, Kevin McCoy of Carlton Fields and Chris Rux of Cherry Bekaert.
Hello, I'm Kevin McCoy, a shareholder and litigator at the law firm Carlton Fields.
And I'm Chris Rux, an audit partner and the healthcare and life science industry practice leader at the accounting advisory firm Cherry Bekaert.
Our topic today is HR and employment considerations before, during, and after a pandemic. Specifically, we're going to talk about the things that are on folks' mind, employers in particular, as their workforce is returning to the office and some of their workforce is staying at home or engaging in flexible schedules, and what considerations need to go into the best practices for dealing with those two contingents. Our guest is my law partner, Rae Vann. Rae is a shareholder in Carlton Fields' labor and employment practice group. She is also vice president of Core Triangle, a wholly owned subsidiary of Carlton Fields that provides HR risk management consulting for private and public companies. Welcome, Rae.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm happy to be here.
So, Rae, thanks for joining us. Really excited to hear your perspective on a lot of these issues, which I think are really pertinent to the employers out there. So just to kind of kick it off, I guess my first, question would be in terms of what are your perspective on the employer's obligations in terms of safety of employees in the event that, one of the employees does actually test positive for COVID when we're all going back to work?
Thanks, Chris, for that question. I will just say at the outset before answering that question that it's really important for employers to be mindful of the fact, employers and employees, to be mindful of the fact that the world's just not the same as it was when we left the workplace back in March. There obviously have been many things to have affected us, and both at work and at home, and businesses really ought to take a step back to make sure that their company culture has not been negatively impacted or will be negatively impacted in terms of how they ramp back up. Think about culture and brand reputation in addition to the top of mind priority of keeping, as you said, employees as well as clients and customers safe. So in terms of an employee who returns to work who is sick, an employer should have at this point put into place strict protocols with respect to health and safety, right? And that ideally would have happened and been spearheaded by a multidisciplinary team, including occupational health folks, HR, compliance, legal, and so forth. So at this point, now that employees are coming back, the question is how those health and safety policies and procedures are being implemented. One of the first things that an employer will have done, hopefully, as part of its health and safety procedures, COVID related, is to put into place some type of check or scan or procedure to ensure that they're not letting into the workplace any workers who have symptoms or who report having possibly been exposed. That process, if it's applied properly, will immediately flag anybody who is sick or has symptoms, and that person should be sent home. There is categorically unless and until he or she can return to the workplace with documentation that the individual's no longer infected.
Rae, I have a follow-up on that. So you talk about the policies and procedures. How important is it for employers as they're developing these procedures that hopefully they already have in place to be documenting what they are doing along the way and documenting the employee buy-in? I hate to sound lawyerly, but to use the phrase, papering the file, in terms of the employees signing off and acknowledging procedures, and acknowledging that they'll abide by procedures. How does that play into this entire dynamic for employers to be protecting themselves?
Yeah, that's very important, both from a risk mitigation perspective, but also from an employee relations perspective, right? Because employees are going to want to make sure that their employers are doing everything within their power and authority to keep everyone safe and protected, right? So part and parcel of that is making sure that employees understand what the policies are and agree to abide by those rules. Now, there is an opportunity going back to work post-COVID for employers to take a look at their existing policies and make sure that they're revised appropriately to address the new health and safety protocols, the new safe distancing measures, and everything else that's been put into place with respect to COVID, but also have been revised and modified to address any new federal, state, or local requirements that have been imposed in response to COVID. That all adds up to a perfect opportunity to redistribute the policies and require employees to acknowledge that they have read and understand what's expected of them.
So it sounds like there's two things that come out of that. There's the good in terms of a written policy from the employer perspective, because they are actively thinking about this, but the policy can actually be a tool to communicate with employees and let employees know that there's been thoughtful decisions made about their safety as part of the buy-in process, if I'm hearing you right.
That's right. And, it's really important not to overestimate the importance, or overstate, I should say, the importance of communications. And these communications should take different forms, right? In addition to the written policies, there ought to be a process in place whereby managers and supervisors have an opportunity to verbally reinforce the rules and the expectations, both in formal and in informal meetings, and also incorporate a discussion about these policies into dedicated or standing training programs, right? These are new procedures. These are new expectations, new rights that employees and employers are all going to have to become accustomed to as they're returning to work. So it's really important to have a multifaceted communication strategy out the gate.
So, Rae, as a follow-up to that specifically, I mean, we're in the professional services, or my firm, we're professional services. We have clients, we go onto client sites. What would you recommend in terms of protocols to communicate to our employees about the safety at our client sites if they do need to go there? That's frankly, it's a concern of mine personally.
Right. And, that's a really interesting issue that we're going to have to see how it plays out. But, a best practice is to make sure that there's some understanding before any employee approaches another work site with that employer or that vendor or customer, that they are following all of the rules. Federal, state, and local health and safety authorities have issued guidelines and, have requirements in place with respect to what employers are supposed to do to maintain the health and safety of their workforces. So it is incumbent upon the employers to make sure that they are on the same page with respect to what is expected of them, and then communicate that to the employees as well. If an employee shows up at a vendor or a customer site and is not asked to undergo a screening, as an example, that might be a red flag to that employee, that employee should feel free to communicate back to his or her primary employer, which then can follow up directly.
It sounds like, Rae, the old adage of you're only as strong as your weakest link applies in that scenario, where you can go through all of this process for your own shop and for your own four walls, but then the employer goes out into the world to do the business of the company. And if others aren't adhering to that, it puts the organization at risk nonetheless.
Absolutely. And that's part of the reason why there's been some talk among lawmakers and some business groups about, whether there should be some type of immunity protection, right? Protection of businesses against COVID infection claims, right? There is no fail-safe means of confirming whether or not an individual was exposed or became infected by someone in any particular workplace or at church or at a grocery store or a restaurant or whatever have you. So under those circumstances, the idea of protecting employers from liability for COVID exposure and claims that stem from that makes sense. But as I think we've said throughout this discussion, employers still are responsible for complying with those health and safety mandates and using reasonable care to protect workers, customers, vendors, or clients. But I guess my point is that you're correct. There's nothing that can be done to 100% guarantee the health and safety of employees with respect to potential exposure to COVID. We haven't gotten there yet as a society. We're not at a place where we're able to trace and track infection and potential exposure to that degree.
And Rae, gosh, I wish we were at that place. It would be a much more happier America, I would think.
Yeah, Chris, you run an office where you have highly trained professionals who are out doing business for clients. I imagine you're still dealing with some folks who are working from home or looking at flexible schedules. What are some of the issues as an employer that are on your mind as folks are looking at these alternative arrangements in the current COVID, post-COVID time period?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that comes to mind. Let me backtrack. I apologize. The majority of our workforce is still working from home, and one of the biggest things that comes to mind to me about the risk there is with information security. We deal with a lot of very sensitive data, including medical data, whether that relates to HIPAA or whatnot, and having employees at home, not within the our four walls where we know that data is protected. It does give me a little bit of pause there, but at the end of the day, I think, and Kevin, you can disagree if you want, but I think that's going to be I hate the term, but the new normal is that there's going to be a significant amount of our workforce nationwide, in especially in the professional services arena, that's going to be working from home. So that's a concern of mine, is that data security.
Is that something that employers need to be looking at when we talk about these policies, not only for the return of workers, but those who are going to be staying at home and building these policies out? Is that an element that employers should be looking at, or frankly have already looked at in maybe the last 5 months since the world kind of went underground?
No question about it, Kevin. And Chris, you're absolutely right that this time, and with seemingly the entire world transitioning, at least at some point in time, to a remote workforce, the risk of cyber attacks and cyber incidents and cyber crime, frankly, have increased exponentially for sure. And Kevin, to your point, one of the reasons why it will have been important for businesses to have established a multidisciplinary COVID response or action team is to have someone from IT involved in the process of building out or refining their IT cybersecurity policies and procedures to address these very things. There are a number of best practices that employers will want to be thinking about in this space. Again, not only to minimize risk of inadvertent or unintentional disclosure of confidential information, but also to minimize the risk of affirmative attacks and cyber crimes, right? So, and your IT folks will know exactly, or should know exactly, what needs to happen here. You got to make sure that the system is up to date, that all of the necessary patches have been applied to the remote work system that you have in place, and that activity, suspicious and otherwise, is reasonably monitored and can be addressed immediately. Here again, so important to constantly communicate with your employees. Remind them regularly to be on the lookout for malware, phishing scams, all of the more sophisticated strategies that cyber criminals are pursuing, especially in this remote workforce or workplace, to try to get at confidential and information and company trade secrets through email or through social media and things like that. Also important to make sure that your supervisors and managers also know what to look for, right? So really it comes down again to planning and executing those plans and communicating those plans and strategies and expectations to your workforce. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It does.
Absolutely. Rae, what as somebody who does HR, ADA, EEO types of issues and consults on that on a daily basis, what do you see as the biggest sea change in terms of an HR or employment relations aspect of the pandemic? I mean, if you had to put your finger on one thing that you say, this has changed forever, what would you say that is, that employers need to be giving a close look at?
That's a great question. So aside from workplace flexibilities, which is a big one, just in terms of the availability of work from home and flexible work schedules and things from that, I think there are some important EEO considerations for employers to be mindful of, especially with respect to individuals with disabilities. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is the chief federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. But under the ADA, in addition to prohibiting discrimination, employers also have an affirmative obligation to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities who need them in order to perform their jobs effectively. So this question of reasonable accommodations is an important one. There are going to be individuals with disabilities who may face significant added health risk as a result of potential exposure to COVID, and who may, as a result of that, seek workplace accommodations to minimize that risk, right? Employers have to understand their obligations with respect to considering reasonable accommodations, and then also understand what they are or aren't required to do in response to a request for an accommodation. Aside from ADA issues and reasonable accommodations issues are just general discrimination issues. There were some cases and some issues that arose early on into the pandemic with respect to the origins of the pandemic and people attacking certain ethnic groups based on some perception that their ethnic group or their country of origin is or was to blame. So that's another thing that employers have to sort of think about and be mindful of as people come back into the workplace. Remember, a lot of folks, many workplaces have been remote and employees have not had an opportunity to engage together physically. So to the extent that there may be coarsened social discourse happening at work around these issues, it's important to be mindful of those and to prepare for them. And then, finally, and this goes back to flexible work and things like that, to the extent that schools haven't reopened or have gone to, all virtual learning for the upcoming school year, or daycare centers aren't open and available, there is a possibility that those caregiving responsibilities will fall more harshly on certain groups, women, for instance. And so employers need to be mindful that they recognize in their policies that possibility and ensure that the application of those policies are not having a disproportionately negative impact on women or any one particular group from an EEO perspective.
That's an excellent point, Rae, and one that I think maybe gets lost if you don't keep it front of mind, because it's so easy to move forward and think everything's fine just because this is working for you. But your labor force, especially as you explained it, if there are states or counties or areas where your labor force can't get back in, and that disproportionately impacts, for example, women in your office, and now they're not having accommodations to facilitate their participation, I could see how it not that it's deliberate necessarily, but because there's just not consciousness around it that it can happen even when it's not deliberate. So I think that's an excellent point and one that everybody needs to keep front of mind. We're almost out of time today, but I think we have time for one last question. Chris, is there anything else that is front of mind for you on these topics?
Yeah, on these topics, I think one thing that Rae, I'd like to just get your thoughts on briefly is it seems like there's a very common theme here. It's education and training of our people, if you will, to do the right thing and act in the right way and manner. Any thoughts there on what's a good protocol to, hopefully people have started to think through this, but really how to get this out, kind of quickly and effectively?
Yes, I think that, as we said at the outset, having written policies available and in place is helpful. Now, whether every employee reads every page of the revised policy manual that you send out, that's questionable, right? But highlighting specific policy statements or areas that folks need to focus on is important, and communicating that in a personal way, right? Via email, their manager or supervisor, or even, the business line president or, an executive sending out an email saying, hey, this is important to us because you're important to us. This is not about us avoiding our responsibilities. Quite to the contrary, we are doing everything we can to make sure that everyone is safe, right? It's engaging in that dialogue in a way that speaks to the policy, but also breathes life into it so that your employees and workforce are invested, right?
Yep.
That's great.
No, I think you said it perfectly. That engagement with the employees and the employers, I think is imperative, in my opinion, especially in this time. We've most of us have been working from home for a long time, but as we come back together, just making sure that engagement together, so that everyone understands that we are one team, striving for a collective goal.
Right. It's all designed to show, not just tell employees how these measures are intended to work and why it's important culturally.
Well, this has been fantastic. I tell you, every time we do one of these, I learn more. That's the point. And things that you need to think about, things that you need to plan for, and ways to go about it, because there's a lot bundled up here, including things that you just need to stop and kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes as much as anything else. So I have to say, Rae and Chris, I appreciate your time today. This has been educational for me. I hope you all enjoyed it. Very much appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk, and thank you very much.
Absolutely. Likewise. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for listening. You can get this content. It will be available on the Carlton Fields website and the Cherry Bekaert website. And we appreciate everybody's time today and look forward to future podcasts in collaboration with Cherry Bekaert and Carlton Fields. Thanks, everybody.
You've been listening to Ledgers and Law, Lessons from the Trenches with Kevin McCoy of Carlton Fields and Chris Rux of Cherry Bekaert. This podcast is intended for general information and educational purposes only and should not be relied on as if it were advice about a particular fact situation. The distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and receipt of it does not constitute, an attorney-client relationship with Carlton Fields or client relationship with Cherry Bekaert. Thanks for listening.